Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into exactly what happens when you push electrolytic tough pitch, or ETP copper, absolutely to its physical limits. We're going to compare standard room temperature rolling against extreme cryogenic rolling, really looking to see how plummeting temperatures fundamentally alter the very fabric of this material. Here's our game plan for today. We're going to hit the baseline and process variables, look at dislocation and energy accumulation, dive into nucleation and softening mechanisms, check out strain localizations and texture, track time-dependent hardness decay, and finally synthesize all these mechanisms together. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. Baseline and process variables.
Okay, so our starting point is this incredibly pristine, annealed baseline state. What we're looking at here are large equiax grains. They're averaging right around 11.5 micrometers in size. And if you look at the kernel average misorientation, or CAM, it is remarkably low. We're talking just 0.81 degrees. Basically, this means we have near zero stored strain. It's literally a blank canvas before we introduce any severe plastic deformation. Section 2. Dislocation and energy accumulation. Now, this progression is where things start getting really wild, because it perfectly captures the divergence between our two processes. Just contrast the rapid dislocation accumulation in cryogenic rolling against standard room temperature rolling. You'll notice the cryogenic process peaks incredibly early. Bam, it hits a CAM of 3.33 degrees at just a 40% reduction. Meanwhile, the room temperature rolling is dragging its feet. It takes much longer, displaying a delayed peak of 3.24 degrees only after a 60% reduction. So cryogenic rolling is massively front-loading that strain.
So you might be wondering, what does all that early massive strain actually do? Well, the extreme strain incompatibility we just saw in the cryogenic process sets up a violently steep energy gradient. And this massive stored energy, it doesn't just sit there doing nothing. It acts as the ultimate thermodynamic driving force for the spontaneous nucleation of brand new, completely dislocation-free grains. And the kicker? This happens even at room temperature. The material is literally scrambling, trying to heal itself from that extreme stress.
Section 3. Nucleation and softening mechanisms. Here is where the underlying physics fundamentally split. We see a really clear divergence. Room temperature rolling is completely dominated by continuous static recrystallization. Basically, that's just a progressive, gradual rotation of the subgrains. But on the flip side, the extreme energy environment of cryogenic rolling forces discontinuous static recrystallization. This is a rapid, highly localized, and almost explosive nucleation process.
When we map this all out into a complete framework, those two distinct pathways become super obvious. The continuous cycle for room temperature rolling shows this nice, gradual recovery. But looking at the cryogenic pathway, that extreme energy state totally bypasses progressive subgrain rotation. Instead, it goes all in on rapid, discontinuous nucleation directly at the grain boundary bulges. It is a fundamentally different mechanism for structural relief.
Now, we really need to zoom in on these tiny dark spots. These are non-deformable copper oxide particles scattered right within the matrix. During cryogenic rolling, the copper matrix is deforming intensely all around these rigid little particles, which generates a massive buildup of geometrically necessary dislocations. Basically, these oxides act like highly active trigger sites for particle-stimulated nucleation. The stored energy right at these interfaces is just off the charts, making them the absolute perfect breeding ground for new grains.
Section 4. Strain localizations and texture. Take a really close look at these banded features slicing across the elongated grains. They're sitting at roughly a 35-degree angle to the rolling direction. These are strain localizations, and they are incredibly prominent in the 80% cryogenically reduced specimens. Now, these aren't just your run-of-the-mill deformation bands. Because of the intense stress levels, they act as highly volatile zones that inherently fragment the material's crystallographic orientation. They are quite literally tearing the unified structure apart just to build a new one. And here's the macroscopic result of those 35-degree bands. In standard room temperature rolling at an 80% reduction, we get this very standard dominant cube texture. But for our cryogenic sample, because nucleation is locked strictly within those angled strain localizations, that standard cube texture is physically suppressed. No way around it. Instead, the material is forced into developing copper, Gauss, and S orientation components. So, how does this actually translate statistically? Well, when we correlate these localized micromechanisms back to the macroscopic texture index, we get a real surprise. Room temperature rolling steadily strengthens the texture, right? But check out the cryogenic data at 80% reduction. The texture index shows a statistically significant weakening, plunging down to 3.595. And why is that? It's all because of that massive grain fragmentation and localized nucleation we were just looking at.
Section 5. Time-dependent hardness decay.
All right, here is the ultimate proof of that instability we've been talking about. Look at this 15-day micro-hardness decay data. Our cryogenically rolled 80% sample hits this incredible, sky-high initial peak hardness of 138.8 Vickers. But watch the curve. It just relentlessly drops off. This perfectly confirms that the massive stored energy generated by the cryogenic process is driving continuous dynamic softening and recrystallization. And remember, this is happening while the material is literally just sitting there at room temperature.
Section 6. Synthesis of the mechanisms. Let's bring it all together with this summary matrix comparing our two processes head-to-head. Room temperature rolling is all about gradual energy accumulation and continuous mechanisms, leaving us with passive particles and strong cube textures. But cryogenic rolling, it's a completely different beast. We're talking rapid, extreme energy accumulation that drives discontinuous mechanisms and particle-stimulated nucleation, which ultimately gives us a fragmented, weakened macroscopic texture. And that brings us to the big, overarching takeaway, the cryogenic blueprint. You see, cryogenic rolling doesn't just amplify deformation, it fundamentally rewires the material's thermodynamic pathway. By maximizing that stored energy, it creates a microstructural state that is inherently harder, yes, but also dynamically evolving and softening the moment it hits room temperature. Which leaves us with a fascinating, kind of provocative thought. Given this inherent, spontaneous room temperature instability we've just unpacked, does this microstructural state establish a fundamental physical upper limit to the thermomechanical strengthening we can actually achieve in high-purity metals? It's like a giant puzzle, and it's a question materials scientists are going to have to grapple with for a while. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep questioning the science.